Over the years, the internet has become a place with overflowing trends that rise and fall all the time, and mockumentaries, copypastas, and blog sites are a few such examples. Along the same lines, creepypastas were horror-related legends that were shared around the internet, and they typically involved fictional or myth-based paranormal stories that evoked feelings of terror among the users. Among many such creepypastas, the Russian sleep experiment gained so much traction that it's become an urban legend in its own right, so today we'll be exploring it in great detail. Before we go into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origin of the story: Internet myth or fact. Created by a user named Orange Soda, the Russian sleep experiment's origins are traced back to the Creepypasta Wiki website, where it was first published on August 10, 2010. The story recounted an experiment that took place at a covert Soviet test facility in 1947, wherein 5 test subjects were exposed to a stimulant gas that prevented them from falling asleep for 15 days. It explored the effects of sleep deprivation and exposed the audience to some grim facts, such as the transformation of these political prisoners into violent zombie-like creatures. Upon its release, this story became an impactful urban legend and became a topic of debate when readers wondered if the story was real rather than fiction. Often, this experiment is shared with an image of a grotesque animatronic Halloween prop called Spasm, which is implied to look like one of the test subjects. Cold War backdrop and Soviet experiment paranoia. Many researchers looked into this creepypasta and concluded that it reflected the reader's general political anxieties as it was set against a Cold War background. Moreover, the story followed a top-secret experiment conducted by Russian scientists against a war backdrop, and it's interesting how a lot of modern horror narratives are fueled by Soviet science legends. However, there seems to be a lot of research based on this phenomenon, and it's interesting how the Soviets have managed to orchestrate such an image of psychological warfare that it's become difficult to separate fact from fiction. Over time, their propaganda has seeped into societies across the world, especially since Soviet psychological warfare targets whole populations, promotes atomic warfare to bully governments into allying with them, and threatens nuclear destruction upon non-cooperating parties. As a result of their relentless campaign to instill fear among prospective allied nations in a Cold War backdrop, they managed to condition the world population into believing their intentions to take extreme measures. Paired with their technological achievements and missile-rattling strategies, it makes sense why other countries wholeheartedly started believing that the Russians were capable of conducting inhumane experiments on prisoners. Moreover, both the United States and the Soviet Union had conducted secretive studies to explore how extreme conditions target the mind and the body in an attempt to understand mind control techniques and enhance military resilience. Many of these experiments raised ethical questions, such as the human experiments conducted at the Poison Laboratory of the Secret Services, where they tested lethal chemicals on prisoners to create an odorless toxin. Considering the fact that there was documented proof of unethical experiments, it's no wonder that people wondered whether the Russian sleep experiment was actually true. Many real-life cases exposed the grim realities of the Cold War era of experimentation and the extent to which governments dabbled in such disturbing ideas under the guise of scientific progress, and this creepypasta perfectly managed to capture the paranoia associated with these experiments. Plot breakdown of the creepypasta. Set against the backdrop of the Cold War, the story followed Russian researchers as they experimented on 5 prisoners who were captured during World War II. While they were deemed enemies of the state, the researchers promised them freedom in exchange for participating in an experiment where they had to stay awake for 15 days straight. Moreover, they installed microphones and 5-inch thick glass windows to monitor the prisoners before confining them to a sealed room. In order to regulate their oxygen intake and ensure that the toxicity of the gas doesn't harm the prisoners, it was pumped into the chamber at regular intervals. The room was also stocked with dry food, running water, a toilet, books, and cots, but there was no bedding or pillows to ensure that they didn't feel tempted to sleep. As the experiment started, the prisoners seemed all right, and they started talking to each other about their lives in general. It didn't take them long to adapt to their sleepless state, and they hardly ever complained as they were falsely assured that they would be freed if they managed to stay awake the whole time. However, paranoia crept in around the 5th day, and their stories started getting increasingly darker. As they shared increasingly traumatic incidents from their life, they started complaining about their conditions and even whispered things into the microphone or through the mirror. In some strange ways, they attempted to gain the experimenters' trust by isolating themselves from the other prisoners, but this didn't last for too long as they started screaming and clawing at their skin and clothes by the 9th day. They even blocked the cameras and microphones, and one of the prisoners even ran up and down the chamber while screaming at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. As the screaming died down, the experimenters concluded that he might have torn his vocal cords, while the other prisoners also exhibited strange behaviors such as whispering into the microphones, tearing books apart, and smearing their own feces all over the book pages before pasting them over the glass portholes. While the researchers were quite disturbed by this, they were quite surprised when the prisoners went completely silent around the 10-day mark. They decided to wait for 3 days before checking the microphones to see if they were still working, and they were surprised to learn that the prisoners had truly resorted to silence. They were also consuming far more oxygen than regular people, and the researchers then decided to test them. On the 14th day, they used the intercom to provoke a response from the prisoners by telling them that they were opening the chamber to test the microphones. Moreover, they promised that one of the prisoners would be freed if they complied and lay flat on the floor when they opened the doors, and they were quite taken aback when one of the prisoners calmly replied that they no longer wanted to be free. As they turned the gas supply off and entered the chamber on the 15th day, the researchers were terrified to learn that one of the prisoners had died and his organs were scattered all over the place while the rest of them feasted on him. Besides feeding on their dead cellmate, the 4 surviving prisoners had also started tearing away at their own skin while the floor was entirely flooded with blood and water. It was revealed that the gas had turned their minds and bodies into something far more grotesque than they could have ever imagined, and they also begged the researchers to turn the gas supply back on. They desperately wanted to stay awake, and they even put up a fierce fight when Russian soldiers tried to extract them from the chamber. Much to their surprise, the prisoners put up a tough fight and even ripped out one of the soldiers' throats when he tried to drag them out. Their confinement and sleep deprivation had turned them into violent monsters, and they ripped out another soldier's testicles and damaged an artery in his leg. After killing around 5 of the soldiers, one of the test subjects suffered from a ruptured spleen and started bleeding, leaving the researchers with no choice but to sedate him. However, this turned out to be an impossible task as well, and he had to be injected with 10 times the regular dosage of a morphine derivative before he was finally subdued. Even then, he didn't go down without a fight, and kept screaming the word "more" for several minutes until he finally fell silent. The other 3 subjects were restrained and sent to a medical facility where 2 of them kept begging for more gas, while the 3rd was unable to speak due to his damaged vocal cords. He communicated by shaking his head when the staff tried to administer anesthesia, and the medical researchers were finally asked to attempt surgery on his injured organs without any anesthesia. Much to everyone's surprise, the patient didn't react even once during a 6-hour-long abdomen surgery, and the staff was shocked to see that he had managed to stay alive by the end of it. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying it all, and one of the nurses even claimed that she saw him smiling during the operation. After his vocal cords were restored, he struggled to speak and finally wrote a message asking the staff to keep cutting his body. The other 2 subjects also underwent surgery and displayed similar behavior, and it seemed like they desired suffering more than anything else. They also kept asking for more gas so that they could stay awake, and they were finally restrained and sent back to the chamber. While the research team contemplated euthanizing them, the project commander was curious to see what would happen if they were supplied with more gas. Even though the team objected to this, the commander's word was accepted as the law, and the experiment was continued with 3 surviving subjects. They were fitted with EEG monitors and restraints, but they didn't protest against these measures as soon they realized they would be able to consume the gas again. However, it seemed like their sleep deprivation was finally making them sleepy, and they were visibly trying their best to stay awake until they were back on the gas. One of the subjects started humming loudly, while the others started blinking or tapping their legs in an attempt to stay alert and awake. As they linked their bodies to the EEG machines, the staff noticed that their brain waves were somewhat normal, except for moments where they would flatline. It seemed as though they were repeatedly experiencing brain death before returning to their usual state, and this went on for some time until one of the test subjects died in front of their eyes. In a chilling sequence, the project commander then sealed the 2 surviving test subjects in the chamber and even trapped 3 researchers with them. While one of the researchers immediately pulled his gun out to shoot the commander and the mute test subject, the other 2 researchers left the room in a state of panic. As the researcher found himself alone with the final test subject, he declared that he refused to be locked in with him. He then screamed at the subject and asked him what he really was, while the deformed, crazed subject smiled at him. He then proceeded to tell the researcher that he merely represented the madness and evil that resided within every human being. As he took his last breaths, the subject proceeded to declare that he was a representation of everything humans tried to bury deep within themselves, and he was what came to life when humans sedated themselves into silence or fell asleep at night. As the researcher aimed his gun at the subject's heart, he smiled one last time and declared that he was so nearly free as the EEG flatline. Can sleep deprivation really do that? Sleep deprivation can cause irreversible harm to the human body, and on a smaller level, it can lead to symptoms such as slower reaction times, lowered attention span, difficulty in thinking, irritability, poor judgment, and anxiety. On a deeper level, extended sleep deprivation can lead to complete mental impairment and reduces the amount of enzymes responsible for treating brain damage. While it's uncommon for someone to die due to sleep deprivation, it has some serious negative effects on the brain and can cause hallucinations, tremors, and other such symptoms. In the initial stages of sleep deprivation, for up to 24 hours, one might feel tired and worn out before having trouble thinking or focusing on tasks. At this point, they might experience microsleeps, which is where they might fall asleep for a few seconds before waking up, or they even have trouble communicating with those around them. Finally, they'll start hallucinating and have trouble separating reality from illusion, which is exactly how the prisoners first started experiencing paranoia. In the real world, research has proven that sleep deprivation can trigger cognitive disturbances and hallucinations by disrupting brain activity and messing with dopamine levels. An increase in dopamine can then alter the brain's perception of reality, which contributes to the development of hallucinations and hampers one's ability to process sensory information. Such symptoms are far more common than one realizes, and they're often experienced by people who suffer from chronic insomnia and disrupted sleep patterns. In 1963, Randy Gardner set a world record by staying awake for around 11 days in an attempt to prove that nothing bad can happen when one doesn't sleep. However, he did experience severe behavioral and cognitive changes during this period, including memory issues, paranoia, hallucinations, and mood swings. Debunking the myth with science and history. While sleep deprivation can be a harrowing experience, there's no scientific evidence of any such gas that can keep humans awake for 15 days, and we can safely assume that this entire creepypasta was just fiction. The story does seem quite believable, and Dr. Neil Dagnall explained that such experiments resonate with us because they activate our dual processing model. Since the story was designed to extract an instinctual emotional response before one could actually engage in critical thinking and scrutinize the situation, it becomes quite easy to pass it off as the truth, especially since it draws on common fears and provokes us to examine humanity's darker side. Besides touching on themes of isolation and cruelty, this creepypasta also mimics scientific language to seem believable. The entire experiment has developed quite a fan base over the years, and it especially appeals to readers due to its realistic details and attention to scientific language. However, it's not really possible to keep humans awake for so long with some mysterious gas, and one must view this piece of fiction as an example of what can go wrong when countries do not consider the ethical and moral ramifications of scientific research. It definitely serves as a cautionary tale and reminds us not to meddle with human biology to such an extent that physiological functions are altered beyond repair. Of course, this story does deserve a lot of credit for its inventive storytelling, and it serves as a reminder of how powerful imaginative tales can entirely change someone's perspective and cause them to believe things that might not even exist. Real-life parallels, MKUltra and other experiments. While the Russian sleep experiment is not real, there have been plenty of other real-world unethical experiments that serve as striking parallels. For instance, the MKUltra program at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal was allegedly part of the United States Central Intelligence Agency's work with the Canadian government to find a cure for schizophrenia. While this is listed as the official reason behind the project, it was a front to conduct illegal experiments to test whether drugs or other psychological techniques could be used to mind control subjects. While neither parties have officially admitted to being involved in these experiments, survivors tried to receive compensation for their troubles, especially after they were subjected to techniques such as psychic driving. In this experiment, participants were forced to listen to taped messages on loop for as long as 16 hours a day. Then they were put into sensory deprivation environments with limited food and water, and even exposed to large doses of electroshock therapy or psychotropic drugs like LSD. Similar experiments were conducted at Kingston's Prison for Women, where inmates were exposed to electroshock therapy and administered high doses of LSD as a part of their psychiatric treatments. These were considered wildly unethical, especially since the nature of the treatment and the fact that they were experimental was kept a secret from the patients' families. The Russian government had also pushed several ethical boundaries during the Cold War when they fatally poisoned Alexei Navalny with a nerve agent called Novichok. In another incident, a Bulgarian dissident named Georgy Markov was killed by a ricin pellet, while a former KGB agent named Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned to death with polonium-210 under the guise of scientific progress. Such unethical experiments and assassinations have been a part of human history, and many such examples were found at the Auschwitz camps in Nazi Germany, in Japan during World War II, and so on. In the 1920s, Aboriginal Australians were the victims of scientific racism as they were exposed to medical experiments on pain, while Canada also subjected Indigenous populations to unethical experiments to test vaccines in 1933. Other notable inhumane experiments are the Vipholm experiments in Sweden between 1945 and 55, or the experiments in Guatemala in 1946, wherein researchers infected hundreds of mental patients with STDs. At the end of the day, the Russian sleep experiment might just be fiction, but there's no denying that it does seem to be inspired by the cruelties inflicted upon some unfortunate test subjects in the real world. Why people still believe it? It didn't take long for the Russian sleep experiment or other creepypasta stories to rise in popularity, and fans seem to take great interest in this fictional world. In fact, some posts declare that everything is true here, even when it's not, as it seems like the reality of these incidents doesn't matter as long as they manage to evoke fear among the readers. People are quite taken aback by such viral stories that come with an emotional hook and pique their curiosity to the point where they end up digging through such content. It might not even be a question of why people still believe it, and there's a good chance that the readers don't even believe these incidents to be true. However, the digital world is made up of endless sources of entertainment, and stories as gripping as the Russian sleep experiment are bound to hold the reader's attention. Additionally, such content pushes people to express their opinions or circulate them among their social circles, and one doesn't necessarily have to believe in horror stories to talk about them and spook those around them. Research shows that this holds true, especially when it comes to horror, as it exposes us to terrifying acts and stimulates us both mentally and physically. While such content might evoke fear or anxiety, the biochemicals in our body change as a reaction to it, and it results in the release of adrenaline. This results in heightened sensations and surging energy, which explains why people still believe in these stories, enabling them to experience a roller coaster of emotions with just one click. Marvelous verdict! With that, we believe we've explored the entire story of the Russian sleep experiment, from its origins to all the ways in which readers believed it to be real. While it is most definitely a piece of fiction, there's no denying that it invokes some real feelings of terror in readers' hearts. If nothing else, the story was a fascinating read on psychological warfare and the impact of sleep deprivation, which we'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments down below. That's all we've got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.